Hi everyone, it is my honor to be here. My name is Caiyi Liu. My major is Chinese translation and interpreting, which is the process of translating one language into another. Today I'm going to talk about Skopos theory, a very common series in translation studies. So here is the content, and I will explain it from the following aspects. First, brief introductions of Hans Jeremiah. Hans Jeremiah graduated from the University of Heidelberg in Germany. He was a student of Katharina Rees, the famous German translation theorist and founder of functionalist translation theory. Vermeer is a professor of translation and a famous translation theorist with a long career in language and translation studies. Vermeer has published many academic papers and translation works. Skopos theory. Skopos series was founded by Hans Jeremiah and Katharina Rees in the 1980s. Skopos theory is different from the private pursuit of the concept of equivalence and linguistic research method, but emphasizes the function and intention of translation. Studies translation activities from the perspective of behavior theory and cross-cultural communication, analyze and solves translation problems with the method of functional communication. According to Vermeer, the act of translation is an intentional and interpersonal, intercultural communicative act, the result of which will produce the target text. According to Skopos theory, there are three principles to be observed in the translation process, namely the Skopos rules, the coherence rules, and the fidelity rule. Among them, the Skopos rule is at the core, and the intended purpose of the translation determines the method and strategy of translation. Adequacy is the essential attribute of a translation, and the requirement of the translation task must be fully satisfied in the translation. In other words, in terms of communicative function, the translation activity is successfully achieved if the translation achieves the intended purpose of the translation task. Skopos rule. It holds that the primary principle followed by all translation activities is the Skopos rule. Target text conveys information in the target text language and its culture, which is related to the information the source language conveys in its culture. The source text and target text are related to their respective linguistic and cultural contexts. The whole process of translation is determined by the goal to be achieved. That is, the result determines the method. However, translation activities can have multiple purposes, which can be further divided into three. First, the intended translation purpose. Second is the addressee, and the third is the purpose to be achieved by using a special translation method. But usually, purpose refers to the communicative purpose of the target text. That means the target text purpose should be compatible with the original author's intentions. The coherence rule is another principle of translation Skopos theory, also known as intertextual coherence. The coherence rule states that the target text must be interpretable as coherent with the target text receiver situation. In other words, the target text must translate it in such a way that it makes sense for the target text receivers, give their circumstance, knowledge, and needs. If the target text does not fit the needs of the target text receivers, it is simply not adequate for its purpose. Fidelity rule is also known as intertextual coherence, refers to the coherence of the target text and the source text to achieve intertextual coherence. In essence, it is close to the traditional translation series of fidelity to the source text, but it is not a faithful word-for-word equivalence of the target text and the source text. The degree and form of fidelity depends on the source text information received by the translator, the interpretation the translator makes of this information, and the information that it encoded for the target text receivers. Overall, for the conclusions, translation purpose series views translation activities as purposeful intertextual communication behaviors. The purpose of translation determines the translation strategy and method. Therefore, in the process of translation, translator should take the Skopos rules as the primary principle and try to follow the coherence rule and fidelity rule on this basis. So here is the references, and thank you for listening.